director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. And this side event on climate technology and climate justice, can the two be compatible, is co-organized by Stanford University and the Independent University, Bangladesh. The topic that we're about to discuss, climate technology and climate justice, really at the core of whether or not we're going to solve the climate crisis. We know we need technology. We know we need to build lots of big things. We need massive investments around the world. And we also know that the priority on human rights, on equity and justice has to be preeminent, that empowerment among peoples around the world is an absolutely essential starting point for progress on the climate crisis. But what we don't know is how to reconcile the two. I'm joined by 4 really experienced panelists today to delve into this issue in a conversation mode, and looking forward to questions and comments from all of you as the conversation goes forward. The real question that I'll be putting to the panelists, and I hope all of you will be reflecting on as we move forward, is the question of how do we take advantage of climate technology? How do we take advantage of building things at scale in a way that doesn't constrain the opportunities, that doesn't eliminate options for sustainable development locally, that doesn't cut off the rights and pathways of indigenous and rural communities around the world? And how do we make sure that the voices of conservation, of traditional knowledge, of rural people continue to be heard at the same time that we're building the big stuff that provides energy access, that provides comprehensive approaches to adaptation, and that avoids the worst impacts of the changing climate. Let me introduce today's panelists. To my immediate left is Marcine Mitchell. Marcine is the Senior Vice President of Climate Change at World Wildlife Fund, where she's responsible for advancing their climate agenda in the US and globally. She builds greater synergies across WWF's climate change mitigation and resilience initiatives with a particular focus on nature-based climate solutions. Marcine was previously the Global Head of Climate Strategy and Business Development at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, and her real expertise is in building new markets, new expertise, and new investment opportunities in low-carbon technologies and infrastructure. To Marcine's left is Ambuj Sagar, the Deputy Director for Strategy and Planning at the Vipula and Mahesh Chaturvedi Professor of Policy Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and he was previously the founding head of the School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. Ambuj's interests lie broadly at the intersection of science, technology, and development. His recent work is focused on innovation policy for meeting sustainability and inclusivity challenges, energy innovation policy and strategies, climate change policy and politics, capacity development, and higher education policy. And to Ambuj's left is Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, who's a renowned thought leader, international speaker, policymaker, community liaison, and facilitator. He's currently employed as Executive Vice President for the National Wildlife Federation, and he's the founder of Revitalization Strategies, a business focused on moving our most vulnerable communities from surviving to thriving. And to Mustafa's left is Saqib Hook, who is joining us on the spur of the moment. We're really appreciative. Our other speaker was called away urgently to brief the leader of the Least Developed Countries Coalition. And I'll let Saqib introduce himself briefly, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'll turn to the questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saqib Hook. I'm the We're at ICAD. We're a think tank based with Independent University Bangladesh. Thank you for accommodating me on the panel.
And before we start with questions, I'd like to use just a few minutes as a memorial to a co-founder for this event. Salim ul-Haq was an amazing contributor to the climate agenda, who we lost tragically in the end of October. Salim was an amazing colleague, an amazing collaborator, an amazing science leader who got us really where we are today in terms of a focus on the interests of the poor. He was an outspoken gladiator for the interests of the poor being represented in the climate negotiations from the start of climate negotiations for more than 30 years, and played a huge role in creating an environment in which we could have a conversation about climate justice and climate technology. He also was one of the earliest advocates for an extensive emphasis on climate change adaptation, recognizing that mitigation wasn't going to be enough and that we needed to be focused strongly on the adaptation agenda. And he also demonstrated brilliantly that adaptation options can be as vibrant and as successful for poor countries as for rich. And then finally and most recently, Salim really took the charge in a quiet, unassuming, but absolutely unstoppable way of arguing for loss and damage. And I think that the fact that we're in an environment now where there's a real loss and damage fund, Salim's legacy. And if you don't mind, just join me for a moment of silence in remembering the legacy of Salim Hook and all that he contributed. I hope this side event and this COP really are a memorial to Salim's legacy. And let me start with Saqib. Maybe you could say a few things about the agenda of the ICCC AAD and how you see it carrying on the seeds that Salim planted over so many decades.
Thank you, Chris. So we at what we call our ICAD family are very, very keen in picking up the work that Dr. Huck had started. It's something that many of us were very invested in from the very beginning. A lot of my colleagues and myself involved, we joined following a lot of the works and research work that he had done, following similar paths on our own dissertations and thesis. So it's something that's been very close to all of our heart. And over the last month or so, that's been something that we've been having discussions around internally about what are the different ways that we can keep his collaborations and the legacy going. So I'm really, really grateful for having interactions with our partners such as this to be able to keep that work alive, keep working on some of the issues that was really, as you mentioned, he was a staunch advocate and champion for on our damage and our locally led adaptation work. And my colleague, Ms. Ansar, is a climate finance expert who's now currently in the draft negotiations session for that. So it's really key collaborations and our partnerships with the institutions such as yourself as well as others here at COP. So we'd be very happy to discuss many other ways of collaborations going forward.
Political coalitions around climate. And justice is really at the core of that. Say a few things about your perspective on how justice and technology interact and how the American Academy report brings in a new dimension to that discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Chris. You know, we're in this transformational moment right now when we think about the opportunities that exist in relationship to climate technology and addressing the impacts that are happening to vulnerable communities across our planet. When we talk about climate justice, we are talking about communities of color. We're talking about indigenous brothers and sisters. We're talking about lower wealth folks who are dealing with those sets of impacts that are there. What I like, Chris, about this moment and this set of conversation is also that climate technology align with the voices and sets of experiences that frontline communities, that those who have been out there on the front lines brings. It gives us an opportunity to have that synergy to be able to make the change that's necessary. The report that Chris mentioned anchored the work around environmental justice and also a fair deal. And what does that mean? It means that we are honoring the voices of those communities who have been doing the work, often for millennia in some instances, understanding that we have these sets of dynamics of communities who may have been in the fossil fuel industry. And what I mean by that, you may have coal communities in the United States, or those who are working in the oil fields, or so forth and so on. And as we are making the transition, a just transition, we want to make sure that they're not left behind, just like we want to make sure that communities of color and lower wealth communities are not left behind. The report that we put together actually begins to honor all these various people, these stakeholders who are part of the process. Also, it's incredibly important to make sure that the education that is necessary helps people to, one, understand the sets of challenges we have in front of us, but also the sets of opportunities that can guide us to what I often call as a North Star. The other part of it is making sure that when we are talking about investments and mobilizing investments, that the spaces and places that have often been forgotten, those communities and those organizations who have often not received the resources, but yet we're doing the work, that we are redistributing, rethinking about how we make sure that those resources make it to the individuals. And then we also have to make sure that there is a diverse set of options that are out there as we are moving forward. When we talk about wind and solar and thermal and tidal and our transportation routes and our agricultural sets of applications, we have to think critically about how not only do we meet the goals, of the National Climate Assessment or the IPCC, but also how do we meet the goals of everyday people, of the folks who are living in community, which is another part of it. So we were blessed when we pulled our report together that we had folks who came from various diverse backgrounds, sets of experiences, worked in different industries, all coming together to have very difficult and tough conversations and finding a way to, out of all those sets of engagements, to begin to formalize a set of actions that most folks could agree upon. That's what COP is supposed to be about, right? So we've got folks coming from all across the planet with different sets of ideas, of course with that similar goal of being able to address the climate crisis, and that's what our report did also. So I'm trying to summarize it without taking too long.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe to put it in a little bit more of an international context, Ambuj, I know you think a lot about energy access, and as you align energy access with the requirements of justice, how do you make sure that as energy spreads into frontline communities that we're not trampling on the rights of the people there, and that the decision-making and empowerment continue to radiate from the frontline communities?
Chris, I think it's a really important question, and frankly, I think the energy transition conversations, now global, are maybe, at least to my mind, not paying as much attention to the various nuances of how this transition is playing out. And I think, building on what you just said, let me actually highlight three dimensions of justice in this clean energy transition. One is what Mustafa just talked about, is communities that are being disadvantaged as we move away from traditional energy sources such as fossil fuels. And of course, that's been actually very much a part of what's called the just transition conversations that have emerged recently in full force as energy transition is picking up. The second one is what you just said, which is as we think about exploiting these newer sources of energy, such as renewable sources, where you do need, for example, land, you need to make sure that in the rush to build solar farms or wind farms, that we're not trampling on the rights of marginalized people. But to my mind, there's actually a third dimension of justice also in this story, which is not people who are being disadvantaged by moving away from the old sources or disadvantaged by harnessing the resources required for new and renewable energy. But it's actually the group of people who've frankly been sidelined from energy conversations altogether. And the numbers are shocking. The latest data suggests that about 700 million people across the world who don't have access to electricity, and actually a much larger number that don't have access to reliable electric power. We have about 2.3 billion people who don't have access to clean cooking energy. I mean, these numbers are mind-boggling, and these numbers, frankly, despite our efforts, have stayed constant for the last many years. Now, to my mind, should be part of a just transition. Because if you're talking about justice and providing energy for all, then you cannot ignore this very large group, frankly, which have been ignored from much of the climate conversation because they're not big polluters. They pollute only a small amount, and therefore, in many ways, we don't think about them because, in some sense, they are not threatening the climate. But on the other hand, I believe that these are the people who, by not emitting, have given us the headroom that all of us are enjoying today in what people talk about the climate headroom. So to my mind, actually, conversation and the broad energy transition, I think, has to be an integrative view. And I want to just kind of say, I think we're now seeing this very exciting pledge about tripling of renewables. And I think as we think about it, it's being driven by mitigating climate change. It's very important. But in this tripling of renewables, I think there is an opportunity to also integrate energy access. And so I think it has to be part of the agenda. So I think the climate technology and climate justice.
We have the environment in the conversation, and one of the important features of the clean energy transition is that we'll need large amounts of land for solar, large amounts of land for wind farms and for mining critical elements. An important aspect of the justice agenda is protecting critical resources. And how, as a member of the world's largest conservation organization, do you think about the balance between the natural conservation and the energy development in the context of justice?
Great, thank you so much. Building on some of the things that other speakers have said in addressing the issue of nature, WWF just did a report along with BCG in which we compared a scenario of accelerated renewable energy and business as usual. And what we found in almost every aspect, whether it was water quality, air quality, land use, even including mining, human health, human welfare, in all of those aspects, an accelerated renewable energy future scenario was better and superior to a business as usual case. So I think that's really with nature and environment and a renewable energy future. And I'm not saying there are absolutely going to be impacts, right? There's impacts in terms of jobs, greater impacts in terms of, nature and preserving nature, air. The starting point is we know that accelerating renewable energy, a clean energy future, is a better future for all, biodiversity, humans, etc. But there are ways to do it, right? And there are ways that we need to mitigate our impact on nature and accelerate the benefits to people. We often think of, again, with climate and impacts of just the downsides, but there are opportunities, right? There are jobs, there are cleaner health and cleaner water, so we need to do that. So we have borrowed something in the conservation world called inclusive conservation for the climate side, right? And this really is about making sure that there are community benefits as we develop new technologies and move to a clean energy. And it's so important. We don't do stakeholder engagement that well. We've got folks here in this room and we're smart and we come together and we're figuring things out, but we and we neglect making sure that there are benefits at the local level for people. And that's really important, because if we do not explain this to people, if we do not show people the huge transitions, because change is hard and change is scary, inclusive clean energy, so that people feel these type of changes.
One thing I heard from everybody is an emphasis on process in addition to the emphasis on outcome. And maybe I'll swing back to Saqib and ask how in Bangladesh in particular you think about processes that include frontline communities from the start and not add them at the end almost as an afterthought.
That's exactly, I think, the crux of the issue is that oftentimes when you're engaging with stakeholders, particularly in the Global South, because there's such a rush of getting the funding out, because the funders are already ready with the project that they're likely to get ahead with, oftentimes the communities are a tick box stakeholder meeting that happens. They're not committed and they're not involved in the design process. And for that, again, it leads to the challenges because the communities are not 100% bought in on the idea, because they're not the ones that are involved when it was being designed. They're only brought in as the bulldozers are coming, as you're building an infrastructure or whatever other activity that you're going to be implementing. So a lot of the process that we've been working on has been focusing around the issues of locally led adaptation, where the locals are the ones that are setting the priority, are the ones that are in the design phase, are the ones in the budget meetings, are the ones in the planning meetings. And again, from behalf of our, we've been working with a lot of sub-national actors, because oftentimes the government is seen as a homogeneous entity, which it really isn't. So again, national entities, ministries and divisions that happen at the central government in the capital don't often filter down with their plans and their strategies and their budget allocations down to their local counterparts, down to the city councilor's office, down to the ward commissioners, and really it's bringing those people along as well into the idea that these are issues and stakeholders that you need to be engaging with local communities. They need to be knowing their local ward councilors, developing locally led adaptation plans themselves, so they're able to set their priorities, set their activities. And when you're talking about, you know, the local priorities, it's very context specific. So it might just be two districts that are right next to each other and they're both on the same side of the river. However, the priorities will be different. There might be water challenges in this one that the other one does not have. There might be significant energy challenges on this side that the other side might not have. And it's really about talking with the local councilors and the local organizations, as well as the local communities, all at one in the design phase, that you're really able to bring those priorities forward. And again, in the issues of climate technology that we have here in the COP, it's really, really important to be thinking about these issues from the perspective of the Global South, bringing these issues from their perspective, not something that we're doing on behalf of them, but really bringing them in to be the ones that set the priority in the agenda. And I would have hoped that quite a lot of the other stakeholder and standing committee meetings would have had more openings for civil society. And that's something that we've been sort of working in how do we get the convention to be listening more on observers and more on communities who can't be here physically. But I know that we're streaming and we're working on activities on the post-COVID world in a hybrid modality. And again, those sorts of things need to be more innovative and need to be more included in these things.
Mustafa, I know that finding ways to engage frontline communities from the start of the process has been a priority for you throughout your career. You want to comment on the things that have been successful and maybe the things that have not been successful?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll just pose a question to folks. Raise your hand if you would make sure, or if you would love to make sure that your voice is heard when a process is being created. So let me see how many people actually want their voice to be a part of it. Let's see, there's one person who does not want their voice to be heard.
There's always that.
Yeah, so you know, it's an interesting, when we ask people to share power, right? Because people have a real difficult time in doing that and being able to help people to understand that there are a multitude of benefits that come out of sharing power. It helps to make sure that processes are more inclusive, as you shared. But I also think that there's another dynamic, and I'll get to your point, or your question here, Chris. The other part of it is also that when we see these processes being developed, whether on the local level, in the United States, on the county, the state, federal level, or even on the international level, if we truly want to make sure that the voices of frontline communities are being honored, then tie it to the resources. You don't get resources if you don't put a process in place that makes sure that those voices are helping to design and implement and also evaluate what's happening. That's scary for some folks because it goes back to people wanting to hold on to power and being able to make all of the decisions in a process. So you had asked what that looks like, Chris, and how has that happened? In my work, when I helped to found the Office of Environmental Justice back in the United States, one of our core elements was that communities speak for themselves. So we made sure that no matter what grant program was created, what policy was created, that the voices of communities were the ones that were helping to make sure that what that design looked like. They helped to also design how we evaluated the successfulness or lack of success of a program or of a resource benefit. So when you start to do those types of things, we developed the model plan for public participation to make sure, and that was created out of the voices of frontline leaders about what's the best way for the government to actually interact with communities. So it wasn't the government saying, here's the things that we're going to do. And yeah, hopefully you're down with that. We made sure that the voices of those who are being impacted actually played that process out. And what does that end up looking like? We have a number of projects now across the United States that are community driven, that are making real change happen. It's doing it in a number of different ways. I talk about one of these projects, it's called the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Whenever I speak, it's okay for you to pull your phones out and Google it so you don't forget what's going on. But the Regenesis Project is a great example of when the government actually listens and allows communities to lead and to develop their own sets of partnerships. They took a $25,000 environmental justice small grant, have now leveraged it over $400 million in changes. The impacts that were happening in their communities was housing. They had bad housing where electricity costs were really high, got new housing, green housing in, bad transportation routes, lacks of jobs, lacks of access to health care, so forth and so on. And the community said, these are the things that we want, and the government then had a responsibility along with other partners to figure out how to support that. So when you ask that question, Chris, it is about listening to communities and making sure that we are not just saying that we heard them, but actually creating the programs that they are asking for, and then swinging back around in partnership with them to evaluate the effectiveness and what changes need to happen. And that's one of the ways that we've been able to make sure that the voices of communities is leading in what's happening.
Marcin, can I tap into your banker experience and ask about the point Mustafa raises about connecting resources with performance, with actual delivery? And in your experience with the IFC, were there things you could do in order to lean on loan recipients in order to increase their willingness and their commitment to engaging the frontline communities?
Yes, I think that, that there's kind of a new thinking in terms of what we'd call results-based lending, right? So, often we think of just the inputs. I've done this, or the lending comes here, the money goes there, but do you have the results? And, if you marry that with community outcomes of what they think is success, if that's the process of the results, then you're managing your funding in a way that gives the impacts and the results that the communities can embrace and can actually feel into their lives. So that's been kind of a new wave of, instead of input-based funding, it's results-based funding tied with community input and recommendations.
Which we've heard lots of really compelling suggestions about ways to stimulate community engagement. But one could also argue that all of these things are slowing down the implementation of the really critically important projects. When you think about corporate development and project development for energy access, how do you think about the trade-off between going fast and going together with a community-led process?
I think, Chris, to me, this really is the key question in the climate space. Because, and actually, frankly, it's not just in the technology space. I mean, this is my view of having followed the climate negotiations now for 25 years. we've always been in a hurry, and understandably so, to push for goals, to move forward. But I think, unfortunately, in the rush to do that, we're not spending enough time thinking about exactly how do we go about it. And so, I mean, I think, for example, I was sitting in India now, it's pretty clear that, the climate issue really cannot be thought of in isolation. You have to think about climate and development as being intertwined. So if you think about even energy access, one could say we're moving forward in energy access by bringing the electric grid to people or by putting up distributed renewable energy. But the reality is that providing people electric power is a necessary but not sufficient condition for improving their human condition. Whether it's health services, whether it's economic livelihood generation, and other kinds of opportunities, that requires another set of technologies that often are necessary. And so I think, unfortunately, to my mind, what's happening is in the rush to meet climate targets, we're not giving enough thought to some of these other questions, which would come up if we were doing the right kind of participation, because what people want, at least in developing countries, but I think not just developing countries, even when you look at within the US, you look at the marginalized areas, people want development. And so we really have to make sure we integrate the two properly as we move forward, because otherwise my concern is, for example, even with this tripling of renewables, we're going to be rushing forward to meet the target, and the easiest way to meet the target is through grid-connected renewables, utility-scale renewables. That will allow us to do triple the renewable energy. It will certainly do a lot to protect the climate, which of course is good for all people, including marginalized, but it may not necessarily deliver the kind of development benefits that we'd like. So I think this question of how do you marry the two is key. And I want to kind of just add maybe something to what Mustafa said. Unfortunately, I think in the climate space, when we now talk resources means finance. I mean, I'm amazed at how much of the conversations today are finance oriented. Unlocking finance, mobilizing finance. I'm not saying that's not important. But to me, where I sit, if you want the right kind of empowered community engagement, an important part of the agreement is knowledge. How do we think about actually, how do we frame the discussions? What is the tripling of renewables for? What is climate mitigation for? How do we make sure we actually have empowered communities giving their inputs into this and understanding what the options are? Because frankly, in many cases, you can have community engagement, but it's kind of a quasi-farce, right? So to me, as we think about resources, finance is really key, but knowledge is really important. And frankly, for me, people like you and I who work in universities, I think we have to really think about that. How do we make sure we're generating the knowledge that is useful to informing this transition so that justice elements are fully included, and also then putting it into our education programs so that the young people we're educating are also able to think about these issues in the broad and inclusive way that's required to truly engage with the problem.
Right. Chris, can we jump in?
Saqib, I know you need to leave pretty soon, and coming from an institution that has in its name linking climate change and development, I wonder if you want to just close with some thoughts on that, and I do want Marcin and Mustafa to jump in as well, but
Thank you, Chris,
since you
and
need
I'm
to
really
leave.
sorry to be having to be heralded into another event out of this, but what I would say in that is, as you quite rightly mentioned, our center is focusing on climate change and development, and in fact, through our collaborations with the university, Independent University Bangladesh, we run a specific master's course about that, because for so long people have been seeing that as something at loggerheads, that if you are focusing on one aspect, you're being detrimental on the other. And really, that's not the case. And I think, as Marcin mentioned, that there needs to be a rethink about these sorts of elements, because there are ways to be doing this that is a just way of doing these things, bringing in community focuses, bringing in the local adaptation issues at the forefront while development is being planned, so that we don't have worsening climate impacts being put onto communities who will be the first sufferers anyways. So already they're facing the double-edged problems of being marginalized and being the first victims of impacts from climate change. And within that, what I would say is, if any of you have been following a lot of the work that's been happening with the least developed countries group, particularly in Bangladesh and several of the other nations, we would say that the reframing is of bringing those communities and those countries that are at the forefront of these climate impacts, because they're the ones that are the first responders and they're the first resilient. And if you look at some of the development paths that many of them have been going on, a lot of them have not been focusing on the step-by-step incremental development that quite a lot of the global north have done over the last 100 years or so, but they're looking at leapfrogging, they're looking at jumping ahead. And I think I take on Muj's point about when you are leapfrogging in terms of energy technology, in terms of infrastructure and housing, it needs to be done in the just way so that it's not done to the communities, but done with the communities step by step. I think I'll end with that. I'm terribly sorry to be leaving such a vibrant conversation, but please carry on.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I interrupted Marcine, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just wanted to I think all of us should jump in on this issue about, you know, fast but fair, right? Because it actually is a wicked problem that we need to think about. I mean, we have procrastinated on dealing with the climate crisis for so long. We really do need to accelerate. So the amount of, you know, infrastructure that we need to put into the ground is mind-boggling, right? In such a short period of time. We used to talk about this is the decade of implementation. We are now at you know, 2024. We've got 5-6 years, you know, to start to bend this curve. And so you'll hear in your discussions that people will use this as an excuse, right? To, oh, well, we don't have time. How do we do it in a way that is, you know, productive, that is inclusive, all the things. Bring in communities, right? It's actually a really hard thing to do. So how do we do it? How do we do it well? How do we build our muscles? We haven't done it well in the past, so we need to, so I'm going to throw that out to others because it's easy to say, but it's really hard to do, and we really have this wicked problem of fast but effective.
Mustafa,
Mustafa, I'll give that to you.
fast but engaged.
Yeah, well, everybody knows I like giving real talk, so as long as we're all right with real talk. So it's interesting. Everything you said I agree with. The education is incredibly important, but the access is also important. Because we know when we take a look at who owns the businesses, because we often talk about workers. Workers are important, right? Becoming a worker in the clean economy space is incredibly important. That's one side of the equation. The other side is who owns the businesses. And we know that when it comes to communities of color, folks of color, that the numbers are extremely small. So when we talk about equity, if we want to also address some of these wealth gaps that exist, then we have to make sure that ownership becomes not just a possibility, but a reality for a number of folks. So more real talk. We also know when we look across our planet right now in relationship to the clean economy, and I am a huge champion for it. I speak about it all, you know, in many, many different locations. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring into our conversation those children in the Congo, who, as we are making this mad dash to be able to have these in our computers and all the other pieces of technology that are necessary for this new economy, those children are some of the ones that are suffering based upon the decisions. So let me also talk about solutions to those types of problems that we're dealing with. We have the principles of environmental justice that were created in 1991. By people from all across the planet. We have climate justice principles. We have a number of sets of principles that talk about beginning from the very start of doing no harm or adding additional burdens into the space. So as we are rushing forward to address the climate impacts that are happening in this moment that will increase if we don't, we are also placing this additional burden on our most vulnerable. So that means that there has to be some significant conversations about the way resources are going to flow and what we will and will not fund. And if we're not willing to do that, then we are sacrificing people. We are saying that to make sure that we are okay, we are willing to sacrifice others. I believe that there are opportunities in situations like we have here at COP28 and in other engagements that we can begin to build language into our international agreements about what we will and will not do in a much more significant way than they currently exist. And if we are not willing to do that, how do we get the billions of people who we need to, one, have the education, and not just to have the education, but also to be all in and the steps that we need to do? If we're not willing to do that, then I think it is short-sighted And I think that we are creating a set of dynamics that we will continue to have those who have always lost to continue to lose, and those who have always won to continue to win. And I think that a 21st century paradigm does not have to exist in that context.
I'm, it's going to get better, I promise. I hear all of you saying that if we really want to accelerate, we maybe need to start a little slower, and that we need to work to build the coalitions that are going to allow us to proceed at speed. And I wonder if, Ambush, you want to talk about how you make that happen, how you build an agenda around relationships first and then accelerate, rather than accelerate and apologize for not having developed the relationships at the end.
I actually don't have a simple solution to that question,
I
to that
didn't
problem.
expect a simple solution.
But I think, Chris, so let me just say this in two ways. One is, everybody agrees. There's no question that we have to accelerate the transition, right? Because otherwise, the impacts of climate change are just going to be ridiculous all around and hurt everyone. So, to my mind, I think what's required at this moment is two. One is for folks who are actually kind of really concerned about justice questions to be engaged in the conversations amongst each other to really understand the full dimensions of justice. And so have at least some broad, even if it's not a consensus, a greater clarity on what are the different dimensions of justice one has to be thinking about. And justice really plays out in different ways across the world for different communities. And then also engage with the folks who are driving the acceleration. So, for example, I just wrote a piece on action energy access, where it was written with the head of the International Energy Agency, from Sustainable Energy for All, from UNDP and the International Solar Alliance. All of these entities are engaged in driving the transition in some way, in accelerating the transition. And the question there is, in accelerating the transition, how do we work together to make sure that we're integrating this into that acceleration itself, right? So to me, it really is both a better understanding of the justice dimensions and then making sure you're working with the folks who really are the implementers in many ways. And it really is a relationship. But let me add maybe one more dimension to the conversation. I think what's happening in the climate spaces, when we are talking about climate technology, because that's the dimension, I would actually posit that for 90% of the people in the room, and actually often even for myself, that translates to energy technology. The climate technology, what is a climate technology? It's a much more complicated conversation, right? As an academic, I would actually say that integrated assessment models that shape climate policy are also climate technology. Technologies for sustainable agriculture that protect both the environment and climate change is also climate technology. And what you and I have talked about in the past, there are also emerging climate technologies, carbon dioxide removal, solar geoengineering. These are other forms of what are being seen now as climate technologies. And I think as we think about justice, we have to think about not just the energy transition. Of course, energy transition is the heart of the climate transition, but it's not the only one. We have to be thinking about how we protect the oceans. We have to be thinking about how do we protect agricultural systems, because all of them actually have implications for people across the world. But then also these emerging technologies such as CDR and solar geoengineering that are other dimensions of potential injustice. So to me, actually, it's obviously a very complex and major agenda. But I want to make sure that as we talk about all of this, we're thinking about all of these and understanding that when we're thinking about climate technology, we really do need to have a wide frame, because I would be very worried if we're actually thinking about a just clean energy transition, but at the end of it, we have something like CDR, because even an energy transition that's unlikely to move fast enough to meet all our climate goals, we may have CDR that actually is perpetrating great injustice. So I do think that if we want to take this justice question seriously, we have to both understand various dimensions of justice, but also various dimensions of climate technology and the interrelationships.
Yeah.
Of course, that really confuses the issue further, but I do want to make sure that we don't not think about it at
Well, I
least
think
some
the
extent.
goal for today really should be to ask what kind of principles
Yeah.
can be used not only for the energy transition, but for the adaptation technologies and the broader suite of development technologies that WWF works around the world to advance this inclusive conservation agenda. What are the kinds of skills and approaches that WWF expects its people on the ground to have in order to be able to start these conversations?
Right. So when we think about and I also feel like some of the low-hanging fruit, particularly when it comes to technology, has to do with the other transformations that we need. So remember, we have to get, 100 net zero, and about 20% of the emissions are coming from land use change and agriculture. And so in terms of technologies, and in terms of it really hitting, particularly in the global south and lesser developed countries, the first stresses of climate is about food and water, right? Really big stresses. And so those technologies can, again, leapfrog us and be very, pertinent to people in these areas. So farming techniques, satellite imagery, all the technology that we have now about, plants and how to feed ourselves. I was at the Museum of the Future yesterday, and they had this whole thing about, what we know about growing plants now that we can use, the precision agriculture that can actually be taken to, rural communities. Because everybody has one of these, right? Same thing with water. The technologies that can be used with water, clean water, desalinating water, bringing up water. These are things that are technologies that can be used that give access to folks quickly, as well as energy technology. So I think talking about, what do we need to do with big grid, tied renewables, but that we're really, there are a lot of technologies that are ready today that can help in these communities. And then the second part that can help is on resilience and adaptation, because even if we stopped producing carbon or sending carbon emissions today, we've got decades worth of warming that will occur by what we've put in the atmosphere already. And so we know the impacts are coming. We cannot avoid certain impacts. And so we have to be prepared to help people be resilient to them, adapt to them, et cetera. And again, there's a lot of technologies that can help us with that type of risk, that type of weather prediction, that type of early warning systems, that type of nature-based solutions to deal with water. Climate is a lot about water. Too much water or too little water, right? We have technologies that can help us deal with both of those things. And again, those are going to have immediate impacts on families, on households, in their locations, and we can apply those today.
Mustafa, it sounds to me like a lot of what we're talking about is developing a new kind of climate warrior, not the person who makes the new tech startup to get lithium nodules from the seafloor, but a group of people who understand how to engage communities and how to make the process work. I know you spent your career doing that yourself. What does this new kind of climate change warrior look like, and how do we fill out the ranks so that the job gets done?
Well, it looks like some of the folks who are here in the room, of course, but when we're talking about truly being able to address the issues that are happening from the climate crisis, then we have to have new ambassadors. Those ambassadors are going to come from lots of different spaces and places. We need to have folks who are in business and industry who understand these issues, who are thinking critically about them, and are willing to have those important conversations inside of the walls of the places. Coming you know, who are former folks who worked in the fossil fuel industry as well. We gotta make sure that we are building out the educational opportunities. Leaders who have been pushing, and who on those bases will continue to grow as they move, you know, throughout life. They'll have even more influence each and every time. We've got to make sure that the voices of indigenous peoples across our planet have the resources that they need to be able to share their sets of experiences. It's always interesting. We're always looking for these new ways of addressing traditional problems. And in many instances, those solutions come from the folks who have been doing the work for a long time. So when you ask that question, it is literally a tapestry of all kinds of different folks that are the sets of warriors and champions to make real change happen. It's going to also be, you know, the folks who are really good on the internet. You know, sometimes people don't want to talk about these influencers, but they can say something and literally millions upon millions upon millions of people in a second will hear. The question is, how do we partner with them to make sure that they have the correct information, and that once that seed is planted and it begins to grow, that you can then take folks to deeper sets of information that they care about. It is going to also be about artists and entertainers and athletes also playing a role, because they have huge influence with folks. I used to work at the Hip Hop Caucus, so I would work with artivists who really cared about what was happening across the planet and being able to use their platforms to share. But I guess it comes down to each and every person hoping that when you share some information with them in a way that resonates with them, that they will then think about it critically and then begin to share, both in their personal settings and in their professional settings.
Marcin, let me ask you about the flip side of this new class of climate change warriors. I think historically, especially in the environmental movement, we have seen people take exceedingly categorical approaches. This project can't go ahead under any conditions, or this part of the landscape needs to be maintained in pristine condition. And one of the things that's going to be required to have a new generation of engagements operate successfully is flexibility across all of the different actors. And do you have thoughts on what's an appropriate way for the representatives of frontline communities to think about how flexible they should or shouldn't be in the context of opportunities for new projects to occur, but risk of the justice considerations being abused as a result of the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there needs to be a paradigm shift amongst local community leaders and environmental leaders, particularly around the, clean energy and accelerating renewables, about how to get to yes versus, just saying no. We've tended to see in the past to say, no to this and no to this and no to this, versus being proactive on how to get to the outcome that we need and that we want. And I think that we're going through a shift in that. We also need to be flexible in how we, kind of what you were talking about, we have a lot of wisdom. So been a lot of wisdom from the environmental groups and community groups about what works, and then how do we merge that with some of the new technologies. So let me give you some examples. I mean, we tend to, at WWF, want to look at natural solutions and ancient wisdoms first, and then marry that with technologies. So for example, we have this partnership with Google in Mexico, and we're looking at mangroves. And mangroves is those forests that are between the oceans and the land. And they're like the superheroes of climate change, right? Because not only do they absorb carbon, maybe 10 times more than in tropical forest, right? They also provide protection against storm surges and salinity coming into communities. They also are nurseries for fishing, for little fishes that support fishing, which in economics. So we want to preserve that as a natural solution for these communities. But on the other hand, we're working with Google to say, how do we grow these and how do we replant them in a way that takes into account what's happening with climate change and takes into account the needs of the community. So Google is helping us bring in weather stations and data sensors and satellites and drones to be able to understand what these mangroves need. What kind of species do we need? Where should we plant them? What kind of water temperature do we have? What species are more resilient? And that's really important to merge those two things. At the same time, I talked previously about community benefit. So it can't be something that we all come in with these great solutions and we know how to store carbon in these mangroves and then we go our merry way. What are the benefits to the communities? So we're looking at using those weather stations to help them predict storms that are coming, or using our data on water temperature to tell the fishermen when is best to go out. Being able to use that technology, training them on using technology and sensors that they can use in other parts of their lives. And so that's kind of that's the triple win: nature, building the communities, and using technology. So I think that's really important. Let me give you one more example. We are working in a project called Recharge Pakistan. I don't know if people remember last summer or summer before, Pakistan had these incredible floods. I mean, within a summer, a third of the country was underwater. I mean, you can't even imagine how to recover from that. And again, you know, instead of being reactive every time, because these were, oh, well, this is only a 100-year storm or a 1,000-year storm. Well, we know that that's now going to be a 30-year storm or a 20-year storm, and we need to be proactive about it, engaging the communities. But instead of just running out and using technology, which we have, and making hard infrastructure, we came and said, first, let's use natural infrastructure. How do we use nature to have, you know, areas where we can drain that water, right? How do we use areas that we don't develop knowing that we're going to have this flooding, right? How do we move farmlands and areas into safer places? How do we prepare communities to you know, be able to be resilient to these things, and even maybe having to have different livelihoods? How do we have those hard conversations where people have been doing one thing all the time, but we know that they're going to get flooded every time? How do we move them into different ways? So again, we can use technology to help us with that, married with nature, married with the wisdom of the people who are there, right? We're not just saying, this is the technology, we have the answers, but what have you seen? You guys have been living here for millennial. What reactions did you have when you had flooding? Because it's not something different, it's just more intense, it's just accelerated, right? So how do we use that wisdom? How do we use nature and technology to come up with solutions that work for everyone?
And how to get the frontline communities to trust that you're really on their side with this technology partnership.
If I could just add to what Marcine said, everything that Marcine said is incredibly important, but the question becomes, how do we capture our storytelling? How does that become integrated into these technological tools that we're using? How do we make sure also that our information that is going to end up is going to be incorporated into the new AI situation? So I write some on AI, and the information folks are going to utilize to make decisions moving forward. How do all the people in this room, what does that look like for them when they go back home? One, on the and what goes in, because what goes in is what's going to come out of that particular set of processes, and then it highlights all the amazing things that you just mentioned. But we got to make sure that justice is a part of that, or we'll find on the back end that we have some additional concerns. And then you had asked me another question, Chris, and I'll close out, about trusted sort of voices and how do we get those additional champions for this. You know, I'm blessed that I'm also here with a number of medical doctors who is one of the most trusted voices. So we've got to make sure that the stories that they're seeing also makes it back out, and then also that they have the information that they need to help folks as we make this journey. And then we've also got to make sure that our healthcare infrastructure is in place for the challenges that we have going on.
I want to open it to questions from the audience, but there's one more topic I need to ask Ambuj about before, so think about the questions you want to ask. Ambush and I worked together a couple of years ago on a report on solar geoengineering, and Ambush already mentioned the concept that carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering are somewhere in this family of climate technologies, and they have kind of special risks for justice. They have, at least arguably, the potential to dramatically decrease the harms from climate impacts, but they also remove frontline communities from kind of having their hands on the levers of power. And I wonder if you want to share some thoughts about this interface between powerful technologies that can decrease impacts but push people farther from control.
Yeah, Chris, I think this is a question that is, I think, going to increasingly become taken a more prominent place in the climate discussions, because the reality is that despite all of these efforts that we're making across the world to accelerate climate mitigation, we certainly are not going to be mitigating fast enough, unfortunately, to be where we would like to be at the 1.5 degree centigrade target. And so things like carbon dioxide removal already are now very much part of the conversation. I mean, it's kind of quite surprising how the notion of unabated oil and gas, and therefore in counterpart to abated oil and gas, has become absolutely part of the conversations. So we're now expecting oil and gas and other fossil fuels to be abated, right? And therefore we're going to continue to extract them and abate. So it has now already started entering the conversations, and I think it's going to continue to do so much more. And so you're absolutely right. I think we are willy-nilly, actually it's like AI, we're willy-nilly actually put ourselves in a position where we are now expecting these very powerful technologies to save us. And the question, as you said, is what does it mean for frontline? It's not just actually frontline communities, it actually is for a lot of countries. A lot of countries are going to be marginalized in the decision making on this. Who's making the decisions of how much abatement is going to be part of the conversation as we keep on exploiting more and more fossil fuels? How do we decide the appropriate level of abatement? How do we decide where this abatement is going to happen? As we think about solar geoengineering, which is again becoming part of the conversation, how do we make decisions about governing the research? How do we understand what the priorities are in research? And how do we understand, or at least to start thinking about, if, God forbid, we do need to think about deployment of solar geoengineering, who makes the decisions? I think these are emerging questions that are going to be extremely important. Actually, frankly, not just for frontline communities. These are the questions in which only a very small number of the global population can engage. It's going to make everybody a frontline ignored person. So frontline is not going to be on the margins anymore. Frontline is going to become the majority, because the decisions are going to be made by actually a very small number of actors, whether private actors, whether countries, that are actually making decisions about our transition pathways forward, and how do you incorporate these new, very powerful technologies into the pathways. And it really worries me. So I think these are really big questions, and we need to make sure, and I want to just kind of link this up to your point about climate warriors, right? I think these are exactly kind of things that your question of climate warriors, I think this is exactly kind of questions people have to be thinking about, right? When you're saying warrior, to me, warrior means revolution. Warrior is not incrementalism, right? And the question is, you have to think about how to engage with these questions in a very different way than we have. My worry is that our climate stories are still incremental. They really are not revolutionary. So we talk about how to get communities to get to yes in terms of deployment. We're not talking about how do you get shareholders to say, maybe we don't need to make as much profit. And therefore our businesses may want to be thinking a little bit differently. Or people to say, how do we change our lifestyles so that the demands go down for the future? So frankly, I actually don't think we've got there yet. Because when we're really talking warrior, we really have to say, what does really drastic change mean? And that opens up many, many more things. where, by the way, I think technology can play a very, very important role. You know, you talked about social media. I think social media can be extremely powerful in making sure that this kind of knowledge, empowering knowledge is there for people so that they can engage fully, but also how we all become part of the conversation as individual consumers, as shareholders or relatives of shareholders, and so on and so forth. So I actually think there are many, many more things where we've started the movement, but I don't think we've really gotten where we need to go.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
Because I know I have a really different opinion about that, and I know the academics are starting to think, we're not going to be able to make 1.5, maybe not 2, so we need to start thinking of these things like geoengineering, and I know that's becoming normalized into thinking, but I think that we should resist it. I really do. I mean, we have the tools. I mean, one of the big things is it's basically saying we're not willing to do the things that we know we can do. And so because we can't do those things, right, and because we've got interests who are not willing to do those things, we should go to things such as throwing more technology at it in order to solve it. If we internalize the cost of pollution, I mean, this is really what the problem is, right? We're not willing to internalize the cost of pollution in our economies. If we do that, we can make huge gains. And we can't just think of gains as being incremental, oh, this. We can make exponential gains. So it feels to me the ultimate of lack of justice, just as you were pointing out. It's going to be the same small group that has gotten us into these problems that is going to throw a technology that could be exceedingly risky to all of us, which we will have nothing to say about, to solve the same problem which was caused. So I would, at this point, I know that people are thinking about it, they're being intellectual about it, but I would it's visceral to me that we should really resist that in terms of a justice issue, a human, kind issue in terms of doing the right thing. When we have the tools, we can do this. At this point, I'd say it's too early just to totally give up and say, oh yeah, we're just going to keep polluting, so then we have to have these extreme solutions.
I apologize for not quite getting to questions yet.
Sorry.
We'll do this for 2 more minutes.
I do need to clarify on this. I think I wasn't proposing that we start thinking, but I think the point is whether we like it or not, those kind of things are going to be put on the table. CDR, I mean, why should we be accepting?
Can you just define that for everyone?
Sorry, carbon dioxide removal, right? Which has now become very much part of the conversations, right? When you're talking about abating oil and gas, the assumption is that you are going to exploit oil and gas resources and other fossil resources, and you're going to be able to capture the carbon dioxide that comes out of them, abate them, and remove them from the atmosphere or remove them from the stack, and then store them underground, right? That has become actually part of the conversation now.
Yes, but by who? I mean, again, if we even look at the IEA, which is, let me just make that one point, because I think if you look at the IEA report on that, the amount of energy you would need, the amount of ability to capture that, we just can't produce at the level that we're producing and capture all of the carbon. It is economically, physically, almost impossible. And if you look at the technology, solar has decreased by 90%, wind decreased by 60% of the cost over the last decade. Carbon capture, flat. Okay, so the cost of doing that, the IEA saying this, I just think we need to be talking about education. I think we need to be educated about it. So who's talking about this? Who is really talking about this? And is that the road? Sorry, Chris, I know that
Do you want to make a quick comment on this?
My point was not that I'm saying that this should be part of the conversation. I don't want it to be part of the conversation. It is part of the conversation. Actually, all the models that suggest how do you get to 1.5 and even 2, unfortunately, all of those models have CDR built in. Right? That's the reality. More that as this gets put on the table, sure, we can resist it. But we also must know how to engage with the conversation. Because otherwise, we're going to be getting flat-footed. CDR has already happened. that it's
And I
already on
think
the table.
that's kind of the essence of where we are, is profound justice issues associated with really great unknowns about the responses of the climate system. And Mustafa, let me give you one quick chance to weigh in on this CDR geoengineering point before we go to questions.
Well, for me, no matter what the technology is, the question should be, or for me, there are three words that go along. It's do no harm, right? So in the Hippocratic Oath, for my doctors who are in the room, do no harm is a part of the process. So when folks want to introduce new possibilities, the question becomes, and folks have finally started talking about this, we know we got 7 million people who are dying prematurely across our planet from air pollution, 2 million from water pollution. The question becomes, does this help to make sure that those numbers don't continue to increase? Does this help to deal with the co-pollutants that, if we're talking about carbon and methane, and we still have these other impacts that are going on, does it help the situation or not? So for me, it comes back to some very simplistic ways of sharing information. And here's the thing, Chris, I'll just ask this to the folks who are here in the room. All the folks that you know who are not in the climate space or the environmental space, how many of them know that over 7 million people died last year from air pollution? Raise your hand. Not one hand went up in here. Not one, well, except my brother here. And of course, if I ask a question about water pollution, it's the same thing. So when we're having these conversations with folks, then we have to make sure that the realness of what's going on is being shared, and that's not the case. We're making decisions, taking people out of the equation. We always do that. And I think that puts us at a disadvantage. So that goes back to when my dear brother here was talking about education. It is about the realness of the situation that we're dealing with. And then we overlay that with what are the sets of opportunities that may help us to be able to move forward. And Marcine, thank you for talking about nature-based solutions, which have always been here since the beginning of time, and has helped to keep the planet in balance. So it goes back, Chris, I'm sorry, you know me.
No, this
Yes.
was wonderfully animated.
Sorry to
but
be controversial back here.
I do want to leave time for questions, and we have 2 microphone runners. I see one hand already. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that would be helpful.
Yeah, okay. Hi, my name is Mariam Hashmi. I am a student at Georgetown University, and I'm studying politics, and I'm really interested in a career in environmental law. I'm concerned about the amount of misinformation that we have these days. I think, Mustafa, what you were talking about was basically my entire question is, when we're talking about bringing local communities and indigenous people into the conversation, how do we make sure that they are informed, but not from the space of the ivory tower kind of privilege that kind of governs our information systems? So with COVID, in my country, Pakistan, we didn't lock down at all. And we were like, screw it, nobody needs to wear masks. Now people are getting pneumonia, people are dying from preventable diseases because COVID has massive impacts on the immune system, right? So how do we make sure that we can combat misinformation from within our communities? That's essentially my question.
Well, I think the one way we do that is, one, it goes back to resources. The resources need to go to those frontline leaders and organizations. There are environmental justice organizations all across the United States. There are networks that are out there. And of course, there are also networks across the planet that often, or let me say in the past, we'll see what the future brings, have never received the resources that were necessary for them to build the capacity, to build the media, to be able to share the dynamics that are going on. The other side of that is also make sure you're partnering with trusted sources to get it out. And then, if you look at those who are on the conservative side of the equation, they've been very strategic around the misinformation. So they buy up the media sources and they continually, day after day, hour after hour, share the exact same message that people begin to say, well, you know what, it must be true because I hear it. And I hear it all the time. So to counteract that, you've got to have those trusted sources that have the capacity, that have the foundation to be able to share. And of course, for me, many of those come from the front lines in those organizations. There are those folks who we trust who are in the academic side. There are those who I've worked with over the years who come from the business side and who keep it real as well. So when you have that coalition of individuals, then you just build upon that. But you're right, the misinformation is just amazing, because you're like, now you know that people are getting sick and people are dying based upon the any dynamic. That speaks to the core and speaks to the values of
pavilion to also our program. You know, it will interest you to know that Africa, which I know you have this information and data, at the moment is probably contributing about 4% of the global carbon emission. And the concern for me is that our whole government, or let me say the African people, are not really seeing this as a big issue, because they feel if you are contributing about 4% or less than 4% to the global carbon emissions, so why do you have to rock your head? Why do you have to be bothered? But for those of us who are environmentalists, we begin to think about the future. We shouldn't just think about now. We should be able to see how we can mitigate this impending doom that will affect everybody. So my question is the theme education with enough resources? And so that's a question that I have.
The issue of how to engage effectively with the people who are in many ways the least advantaged, where there's the least infrastructure, where there's the least technology, where everything kind of needs to start from scratch.
Well, I think, I'm going to speak as from an academic perspective, right? And I, very much, first of all, appreciate that question. So I've been working with colleagues in India in working towards building partnerships with knowledge institutions in Africa. India is a kind of an interesting country because in many ways people see it as a kind of a knowledge power, but in many ways India, large parts of India actually share social and economic characteristics with Africa. So a lot of the work that actually happens in India, I think, has value for Africa, and for us, much to be learned from actually how things are working in Africa. So to me, actually there's a kind of a natural partnership between Indian and African entities on these kind of questions about how does one understand the questions really, as Chris, as you said, really on the margins. I'm actually working with African colleagues. Yuba Sakona, who is a leading African energy expert for many decades, closely with him in thinking about, again, something that makes sense for parts of South Asia, makes sense for Africa, and many other parts of the world. So in many ways, I think what you're talking about, the challenge in Africa, is a challenge not just in Africa, but in many parts of the world. And I think we really have to think about how to build common cause in learning from each other, working together, understanding what's worked and what's not worked in our countries, and really being able to work together. I really believe in South-South participation, engagement on these questions. It's not that you don't work with northern counterparts. Of course, they also have value. But in the end, I think it's important for us not to become subsidiary entities in this conversation and really work together to empower ourselves in being able to chart the way forward.
Can I answer that too?
Please.
Thank you. So there are two things I think about in that question. One, we often talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, right, globally. But you know that the warming is not happening evenly across. So the most accelerated warming is happening in the tropics and on the poles, right? That's why we're so worried about the melting of ice in Greenland, and we're very worried about nobody can afford it, no one would use that technology, oh, that's just really for the Western things. And and he insisted, no, we really need to invest in telecom in Africa and in India, et cetera. And didn't we look up and there was exponential growth? I've mentioned this before, not incremental growth, but exponential growth. You turn around and you look at Africa and India and South America, anywhere, everybody has a phone, right? And it's made a huge difference in communication and what can be, information that can be brought. So we have to throw away some of that traditional thinking and that traditional idea that we can just grow incrementally. I mean, the hope and the opportunity in places like Africa and India with fast-growing populations is that we can jump over some traditional ways of thinking, of traditional infrastructure. We don't need to do some of the same things that we did and how it was growing. Marry that with the technology, and that's where we can leapfrog. So
Chris,
I was going to channel Mustafa, but I'm going to let you speak for yourself.
I need 15 seconds, because brother, you asked a particular question. I want to make sure that you get a direct answer. So Reverend Leo Woodbury is sitting right here in the audience. So they've actually been doing work in Liberia. And then there's the HBCU Green Fund, which is working with, I believe, 12 different countries in Africa around what you had asked. So I'll make sure that you are linked up with them so that you have those contacts. So that doesn't take away anything from what others may do, but I like to make sure that people get what they need.
And just a final channeling on Mustafa, I think the really critical element of the question you pose is that there are smart, energetic people everywhere, and that if we take advantage of their wisdom and their commitment, they can work to deliver solutions even where they lack resources. And I don't think we should be overlooking anyone, especially not for lack of resources. I think we don't have time for any more questions. They're really pushing on these side events to stay on time, and I want to just take 1 minute to thank speakers for a spectacular series of comments and a deep level of engagement. Mustafa, Ahmed, Martine, thanks again to Sakib. And for me, there's one really important takeaway from this conversation. It's that if we want to achieve the climate solutions that we know we need, they have to start with engaging frontline communities everywhere. We're all frontline communities in one sense or another, but it's in the world's poorest countries that the opportunities and the challenges are most grave, and working to unleash the potential there is something that should be our highest priority. I opened with comments about the tragic loss of Salim, and make sure that the voices of frontline communities are heard, to make sure that adaptation stays at the top of the agenda, and to make sure that the resources follow. I think, at least for me, and I hope for all of us, we can use Salim's vision as an inspirational platform for moving the rest of COP28 and for the rest of our climate journeys. Thanks so much.